The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. You have been deceived, not by malice, but by your own willingness to believe comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. You were taught to equate age with maturity, appearance with depth, emotional chaos with passion. But Carl Jung knew what you were only now beginning to understand. Many people live their entire lives without ever truly growing up. They reach physical maturity while remaining psychological children, and they become expert at hiding this fact behind masks of competence and charm. This is your awakening. The moment you stop confusing what looks like depth with what actually is depth. The moment you recognize that the patterns in your life are not random accidents but psychological laws playing out with mathematical precision. The moment you accept that you have been unconsciously drawn to what Jung called the eternal child dressed in adult skin. You thought you were choosing partners. You were actually choosing mirrors of your own unresolved psychology. You thought you were falling in love. You were actually falling into familiar patterns of rescuing, fixing, carrying emotional weight that was never yours to bear. You thought you were being noble. You were actually being unconscious. Look at the evidence without flinching. How many times have you found yourself in relationships where you became the stabilizer, the decision-maker, the emotional anchor for someone who claimed to want partnership but consistently avoided the responsibility that partnership requires? How many times have you watched someone spiral into confusion and chaos every time life demanded real choices, real commitment, real growth? Some people never complete the fundamental task of human development, taking full responsibility for their own life, their own emotions, their own choices. Jung called this process individuation, the journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, from dependence to autonomy, from fantasy to reality. They remain trapped in what Jung identified as the eternal child archetype, forever seeking someone else to provide what they have never learned to provide for themselves. But you are not here to complete another person's development. You are not here to be the missing piece in someone else's puzzle. You are not here to provide the structure, stability, and strength that another adult should have developed within themselves. When you accept this role, you do not help them grow, you enable them to remain stunted. The modern world has taught you to believe that accommodating a woman's desires, regardless of how unreasonable or destructive, is the mark of a good man. You have been conditioned to think that saying no to emotional manipulation is cruelty, that setting boundaries is selfishness, that refusing to enable dysfunction is abandonment. But this conditioning has turned you into a servant in your own life. You have been taught to follow rather than lead, to react rather than respond, to seek approval rather than command respect. You have been convinced that masculinity means being endlessly accommodating, that strength means absorbing endless chaos, that love means sacrificing your own needs and standards for someone else's comfort. This is not love, this is psychological slavery. Jung understood what modern society has forgotten. Healthy relationships require two complete individuals, not one complete person carrying an incomplete one. A woman who has never developed her own internal structure will unconsciously demand that you provide it for her. She will test your boundaries to see if you are strong enough to maintain them. She will create chaos to see if you are centered enough to remain calm within it. These tests are not conscious manipulation, they are unconscious psychological drives. A woman who has not individuated cannot feel safe with a man who has not individuated either. But she also cannot feel attracted to a man who gives up his power to accommodate her undeveloped emotions. She needs you to be strong enough to say no, to set limits, to refuse to participate in dynamics that serve neither of you. When you constantly adjust your behavior to manage someone else's emotional state, you communicate that you do not trust them to handle reality. When you make decisions based on avoiding their negative reactions rather than doing what is right, you become complicit in their failure to grow. When you sacrifice your own standards to maintain their comfort, you enable their stagnation. The guilt hits you now like a physical weight. Guilt for all the times you ignored your instincts because you wanted to believe in potential rather than face reality. Guilt for the years you spent trying to love someone into maturity, trying to provide enough security for them to finally feel safe enough to grow. Guilt for the energy you poured into relationships that drained rather than sustained you. But this guilt is not punishment, it is education. It is your psyche finally showing you the patterns you have been unconsciously perpetuating. Every time you chose to believe that emotional chaos was depth, that neediness was vulnerability, that dependence was love, you were choosing unconsciousness over awareness, fantasy over reality, comfort over growth. Jung warned that whatever we do not bring into consciousness will return as fate. This is why you keep attracting the same type of person, why you keep finding yourself in the same emotional dynamics, why you keep hoping that this time will be different while unconsciously recreating the same patterns. Your unconscious is trying to force you to see what you have been avoiding. The chaos in your relationships was not random. It was your psyche attempting to wake you up. Every emotional storm, every crisis, every moment when you felt like you were drowning in someone else's undeveloped emotions was a signal that you were in relationship with someone who had never learned to regulate themselves. But instead of recognizing this as information, you interpreted it as love. You mistook intensity for intimacy. You confused drama with passion. You believed that if someone needed you desperately enough, it meant they loved you deeply enough. But need is not love. Dependency is not devotion. Being someone's emotional crutch is not being their partner. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this when he wrote about how people seek completion through others rather than developing completeness within themselves. You see this pattern most clearly in how such women relate to decision-making. They will ask your opinion on everything while secretly resenting you for having to provide it. They will create situations where you must choose between enabling their avoidance and being blamed for their discomfort. They will present themselves as incapable of handling basic adult responsibilities while simultaneously claiming to want equality and independence. This is not hypocrisy, it is psychological fragmentation. The conscious mind wants independence while the unconscious craves dependency. The result is a constant push-pull dynamic where they seek your strength while resenting your strength, need your guidance while rejecting your guidance, demand your protection while criticizing your protectiveness. The breaking point comes when you realize that you have been enabling the very thing you thought you were healing. Every time you stepped in to make decisions for someone who claimed to be overwhelmed by choice, every time you provided emotional regulation for someone who refused to develop their own, every time you offered stability to someone who preferred chaos, you were not helping them grow, you were helping them avoid growth. The answer lies in your own shadow, the parts of yourself that you have not yet integrated. Jung taught that we are unconsciously drawn to people who carry the projections of our own undeveloped aspects. If you have not made peace with your own need for nurturing, you will be attracted to people who embody that need. If you have not integrated your own capacity for independence, you will be drawn to those who seem to offer the dependency you secretly crave. But this attraction is not love, it is unconscious compensation. You are not choosing a partner, you are choosing a mirror for your own unresolved psychology. And until you do the work to resolve these patterns within yourself, you will continue to attract people who reflect them back to you. The hardest truth to accept is that your accommodating behavior was not kindness, it was cowardice. You were afraid of their reaction if you said no, afraid of conflict if you set boundaries, afraid of abandonment if you stopped providing what they demanded. So you sacrificed your own needs, your own standards, your own growth to maintain their comfort. But this sacrifice served no one. It did not make them stronger, it made them weaker. It did not make them more capable, it made them more dependent. It did not make them love you more, it made them respect you less. Because a woman cannot truly respect a man who will not respect himself enough to maintain his own boundaries. The discipline required to break these patterns is not comfortable. It means refusing to rescue people from consequences they need to experience. It means saying no to emotional manipulation disguised as vulnerability. It means choosing partners based on their actual development rather than their potential development. It means walking away from relationships that feel familiar but serve neither person's highest good. But you must develop immunity to these manipulations. Not through cynicism or hardness, but through clarity. You must learn to distinguish between genuine vulnerability and performed helplessness, between authentic struggle and strategic victimhood, between someone who is working to grow and someone who is working to avoid growth. A woman who is truly mature will respect your boundaries, not test them. She will appreciate your strength, not try to undermine it. She will support your growth, not demand that you sacrifice it for her comfort. She will take responsibility for her own emotions rather than making them your responsibility to manage. But a woman who remains in the eternal child state will unconsciously work to pull you down to her level rather than rising to meet yours. She will create drama to test your stability, manufacture crises to confirm your dedication, and generate chaos to ensure your attention remains focused on her rather than on your own development. Real power is not the ability to control others, it is the ability to see clearly. When you can see the difference between someone who is temporarily struggling and someone who is professionally struggling, between someone who takes responsibility for their growth and someone who expects others to manage it for them, you develop what Jung called psychological discrimination. True masculine leadership means setting the standard and maintaining it regardless of how others react. It means saying what needs to be said even when it creates discomfort. It means doing what needs to be done even when it generates resistance. It means being the stability that others can rely on, not the chaos that others must manage. But this leadership cannot be imposed from outside, it must be developed from within. You cannot lead someone who does not want to follow. You cannot provide direction for someone who prefers confusion. You cannot offer stability to someone who is addicted to chaos. Your job is to be clear about your own standards and boundaries, not to convince others to respect them. The walking alone comes naturally once you develop this discrimination. Not because you become antisocial or bitter, but because you become selective. You realize that most people are not actually seeking partnership, they are seeking completion through another person. They want someone to provide what they have never learned to provide for themselves. But you were not born to complete other people. You were born to become complete yourself and then share the completeness with others who have done the same work. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming whole within yourself rather than seeking wholeness through others. When you stop trying to manage other people's emotions, reactions, and choices, you discover something profound. You have tremendous energy available for your own development. When you stop walking on eggshells around someone else's sensitivity, you can focus on building your own strength. When you stop accommodating dysfunction, you can create genuine functionality in your own life. The responsibility that emerges from this understanding is profound. You become responsible not just for your own choices, but for modeling what healthy psychological development looks like. You become an example of what it means to take full responsibility for your own life, your own emotions, your own growth. This responsibility cannot be delegated or shared. It must be claimed and carried alone. But this responsibility is also freedom. When you stop trying to manage other people's emotions, you have energy to develop your own emotional mastery. When you stop trying to provide stability for people who prefer chaos, you can create genuine stability in your own life. When you stop trying to love people into growth, you can focus on your own development. Viktor Frankl demonstrated this principle when he showed that even in the most extreme circumstances, each person is ultimately responsible for their own response to their situation. No external force can determine your internal state without your consent. This understanding is liberating because it means you are not at the mercy of other people's psychological development or lack thereof. A mature woman will appreciate your refusal to enable her weaknesses because it demonstrates your commitment to her growth. She will respect your boundaries because she has developed her own. She will support your mission because she has found her own. She will add to your strength rather than draining it because she has cultivated strength within herself. But an immature woman will resist your boundaries because they force her to confront her own limitations. She will create chaos when you maintain your center because your stability reminds her of her own instability. She will sabotage your growth because it highlights her own stagnation. She will demand that you sacrifice your development to manage her dysfunction. You must learn to distinguish between these two types of women not through judgment but through observation. Watch how they respond to responsibility. Do they embrace it or avoid it? Watch how they handle conflict. Do they seek resolution or perpetuate drama? Watch how they treat your boundaries. Do they respect them or constantly test them? When you finally integrate this understanding, you stop being attracted to people who need fixing and start being attracted to people who are committed to fixing themselves. You stop confusing emotional chaos with depth and start recognizing genuine emotional maturity. You stop mistaking neediness for love and start experiencing what real partnership feels like. Real partnership involves two complete people choosing to share their completeness rather than two incomplete people trying to create wholeness through each other. This kind of relationship feels different because it is based on growth rather than stagnation, on mutual support rather than codependent rescue, on conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. The man who has completed this work is no longer vulnerable to manipulation through guilt, shame, or false emergency. He can see clearly when someone is asking for support in their growth versus when they are asking him to do their growing for them. He can distinguish between authentic vulnerability and performed helplessness. He can recognize the difference between temporary struggle and chronic dysfunction. This man becomes a model for what psychological maturity looks like. He demonstrates that it is possible to be caring without being codependent, supportive without being enabling, loving without being self-sacrificing. He shows that true strength comes not from rescuing others, but from refusing to participate in patterns that serve no one's highest good. He leads not through dominance, but through example. He sets standards not through force, but through consistency. He creates stability not through control, but through his own centered presence. He loves not through sacrifice, but through the sharing of his own wholeness. Such a man naturally attracts women who have done their own work, who have faced their own shadows, who have completed their own individuation process. These women do not need him to complete them. They choose him to share the completeness they have already achieved. They do not need him to provide stability. They bring their own stability to the relationship. They do not need him to manage their emotions. They have learned to regulate themselves. This is your inheritance and your responsibility. To become psychologically whole. to take full responsibility for your own development, to model what healthy relationship looks like, to refuse to participate in patterns that enable dysfunction, to choose growth over comfort, consciousness over unconsciousness, reality over fantasy. The world needs men who have done this work, men who can see clearly, choose consciously, love freely without losing themselves. Men who understand that the greatest gift they can give to others is their own psychological wholeness. Men who know that real love supports growth, not stagnation. You are called to become such a man, not for others but for yourself, not to impress or attract or rescue, but to fulfill your own potential, to honor your own development, to become who you were meant to be. This is the only path to genuine freedom, authentic relationship, and lasting fulfillment. The choice is yours, but now you know what the choice actually is. You can continue to participate in patterns that serve no one's highest good, or you can do the work to become whole and attract others who have done the same. The time for unconsciousness is over. The time for becoming who you truly are has begun.